David Miller sat at the small wooden table in his kitchen. The surface was scarred with years of use, much like David himself. It was 9:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. Outside, the Philadelphia rain had turned into a harsh sleet, drumming against the glass like a warning. He tapped a dull pencil against a stack of papers. The numbers on the table didn't add up. They never did lately. 400 for the electric, 200 for the car insurance. And Chloe's art classes, David muttered to himself. He looked at the balance on his phone screen. He had $300 to last until Friday. It wasn't enough to keep the lights on and keep his 6-year-old daughter happy. He leaned back, the old chair creaking under his weight, and rubbed his face with his calloused hands. He was 40, but some days, especially nights like this, he felt 60. Chloe walked into the kitchen, dragging her favorite blanket behind her. "Dad? Is the heater broken again? It's making that clicking sound. Go back to bed, honey. I'll take a look at it. Everything is fine. Are you sure? You look like you're doing hard math." "I am. But I'm good at math. Go on, get some sleep." She nodded and disappeared back into the hallway. David sighed, looking back at the bills. He had put a room for rent sign in the front window 3 weeks ago. Not a single person had called. The neighborhood was quiet, but the house was old and the paint was peeling. Nobody wanted to rent a room from a tired guy with a kid. A loud, frantic thud echoed from the front door. It wasn't a normal knock. It was the sound of someone hitting the wood with their fist, desperate and fast. David stood up, his heart thumping against his ribs. He grabbed a heavy flashlight from the counter, his muscles tensing. He looked through the small window beside the door, but the sleet had blurred the world into a gray mess. He pulled the door open. A gust of freezing wind swept in, blowing his unpaid bills off the table and onto the linoleum floor. A woman stood on his porch. Her blonde hair was matted to her forehead by the rain. She wore a tan Burberry coat that was splattered with mud at the hem, the fabric heavy and soaked. She was clutching her stomach. She was heavily pregnant, maybe 8 months along. Her other hand sipped the handle of a leather bag so hard her knuckles were white. "Please," she said. Her voice was thin, shaking so hard she could barely get the word out. David didn't ask for her name. He didn't ask what she was doing out in a storm in her condition. His instincts as a father and a man took over. Get inside. Get out of the cold. She stepped into the warm kitchen, her boots leaving puddles on the floor. She was shivering violently. She looked around the modest room, her eyes jumping from the stained wallpaper to the pile of bills David had just scrambled to pick up. She looked like she belonged in a penthouse in Rittenhouse Square, not a 2-bedroom house in a neighborhood where people worked double shifts just to buy groceries. "I saw the sign," she said. She looked at the chair and sat down without waiting for an invitation. She seemed to be running out of strength. "The room? It's just a spare bedroom upstairs. It's small. I don't care about the size. I usually ask for a background check and a deposit." She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her bag. Her hands were red from the cold. She pulled out a thick envelope, bound by a rubber band, and set it on top of the electric bill. "There is $5,000 in there. All hundreds. It's straight from the bank." David stared at the envelope. It was more money than he made in 3 months at the warehouse. "That's way too much for a month's rent. I don't even know who you are." "I'm renting the room," she replied. She looked him in the eye, and for a second, the fear disappeared. A sharp, cold authority took its place. No lease, no ID, no questions. You take the money, and you forget I'm anything other than a girl who needed a place to stay. "Do we have a deal?" David looked at the hallway where Chloe was sleeping, then back at the cash that could solve every problem he had. "The room is at the top of the stairs," David said. "I'll get you some dry towels." Elena didn't say thank you. She just leaned back in the rickety chair and closed her eyes, her hand resting protectively over her belly. While David moved to the linen closet, he didn't notice Elena glancing nervously at the dark street through the kitchen window. She knew they were coming for her, but she didn't realize how much she had left behind. Elena Vance turned the lock on the small, creaky bedroom door in David Miller's house. She leaned her back against the wood, listening to the silence of the hallway. For the first time in months, no one was watching her. She was just a woman in a quiet house in Philadelphia. But while she was finding a moment of peace, the life she had abandoned was falling apart. 300 miles away, on the top floor of the Aegis Corporation headquarters in Manhattan, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. Victoria Vance stood behind her massive desk, her face pale with fury. She picked up the heavy desk phone and threw it against the wall. The plastic shattered, and the cord dangled uselessly. "How does this happen?" Victoria asked. "We have security teams. We have drivers. We have a digital fence around her entire life. And yet, she's gone." Marcus Sterling stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city lights. He didn't turn around. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and his shoulders were tight. "She was smarter than we thought," Marcus said. "Smarter? She's pregnant and alone," Victoria said. "She's a Vance. She doesn't know how to pump her own gas, let alone disappear in the middle of a storm." "Our private investigators just called," Marcus replied. "They found her car. She left it at a gas station 2 hours outside the city. She didn't leave a single bag in it. She even left her cell phone in the glove box. That's why the GPS stopped moving." "And the bus station?" Victoria asked. "You said there was a lead?" The investigators spoke to a clerk at a small station in the suburbs. "He remembers a woman matching her description. She bought a ticket with cash. She didn't give a name. She got on a bus heading west, but we don't know where she got off. It was a gray, crowded station. Nobody was paying attention." Victoria walked over to the corner of the room where a small, concealed wall safe sat open. The door was swung wide, revealing an empty velvet interior. "She took it all, didn't she?" Victoria asked. $2 million in cash?" Marcus said. "It was her personal inheritance from her father's estate. She's been withdrawing it in small amounts for a year. We never noticed because the amounts were below the reporting threshold. She wasn't just hiding. She was planning. $2 million, Victoria whispered. "She can stay hidden for a long time with that kind of money. She doesn't need credit cards. She doesn't need us. We need her, though," Marcus said. "The merger with the Whitman family is set for next month. If she isn't there to sign the papers as the majority shareholder, the whole thing collapses. My political connections, the family's future, it all depends on that signature." Victoria turned to Marcus, her eyes sharp. "I don't care about your political connections right now, Marcus. I care about the fact that she is carrying the heir to this company. That child is a Vance. I will not have my grandchild born in some dirty apartment or a hospital for the poor. The investigators are doing everything they can," Marcus said. "It's not enough," Victoria said. "You're the vice president of this company. Fix this. I want her found before she has that baby. I want her back in this house where she belongs." Marcus finally turned away from the window. He looked at the empty safe and then back at Victoria. He knew that if the merger failed, his career was over. He had spent years setting up the deal with the Whitmans. It was supposed to be his ticket to the top. "She's smart, but she's still a woman in her 3rd trimester," Marcus said. "She needs a doctor. She needs comfort. She can't hide in the shadows forever." "She's doing a pretty good job so far," Victoria snapped. "You told me she was a frightened little bird. Well, your bird just flew away with a fortune." Marcus grabbed his wool coat from the leather chair. He felt a bead of sweat on his neck despite the air-conditioned room. He needed to find her before the board of directors started asking questions. "I'm going down to the security hub," Marcus said. "I'm going to oversee the search myself." "Make sure they look everywhere," Victoria said. "She's out there somewhere, thinking she's free. Remind her that she isn't." Marcus walked toward the door, his mind racing through every possibility. He pulled out his phone and dialed the head of the Aegis security team. "Listen to me," Marcus said into the phone as he stepped into the hallway. "I want a team on every road. I want you to check every gas station, every diner, and every small-town motel within a 100-mile radius of that bus station. She's pregnant, so she's slow. She can't have gone far on foot." He paused, looking at the elevator doors. "And find out if any of our employees live in that area," Marcus added. "If she's looking for a place to stay, she might try to find someone she thinks she can trust, someone who doesn't know who she really is." Marcus Sterling's security teams were already moving by sunrise. They hit every gas station and rest stop within 100 miles of the bus station, showing Elena's picture to anyone with an open eyes. While they searched the cold highways, the morning light hit the kitchen window in Philadelphia, where Elena Vance was waking up to a completely different world. Elena stepped out of the guest room, pulling the oversized gray t-shirt David had left for her down over her waist. It smelled like cheap laundry detergent and old wood. She walked into the kitchen and saw David standing at the stove. He was busy flipping eggs in a pan that had seen better days. The smell of bitter coffee filled the small room. "Morning," David said without turning around. "I hope the shirt worked out. It was the cleanest thing I had." "It's fine." "Thank you," Elena said. She pulled the hem of the shirt again, feeling exposed despite the extra fabric. "Have a seat. Eggs are almost done. Chloe, get the juice out of the fridge." A small girl with messy brown hair and bright eyes hopped off a stool. She grabbed a plastic carton from the refrigerator and brought it to the table. She stared at Elena with pure curiosity. "I'm Chloe," the girl said. "Are you the lady who came in the rain?" "I am. My name is Elena." "You have a big stomach." "Is there a baby in there?" "Chloe, don't pester her," David said. He walked over and slid a plate of eggs and 2 pieces of white toast in front of Elena. He handed her a yellow plastic fork. Elena looked at the fork. She held it by the handle, feeling the light, flimsy material. She looked at the eggs. They were yellow and greasy. It was a far cry from the poached eggs and avocado toast her personal chef prepared back in Manhattan. She picked up a piece of toast, but her hand was shaking. "Do you not like eggs?" David asked. He sat down across from her with his own plate. "No, I like them. I didn't sleep much. The heater makes a lot of noise." "You get used to it," David said. He started eating, his movements quick and efficient. He looked like a man who was always in a hurry to get somewhere. Elena tried to take a bite of the eggs. They were hot and salty. She forced herself to swallow. Across the table, Chloe was watching her every move. The little girl leaned forward. "Why were you crying last night?" Chloe asked. Elena froze. "I wasn't crying. The rain was just very cold. Dad says people only knock like that when they're sad or scared." "Which one are you?" "Chloe, that's enough," David said. "Eat your breakfast. We have to get you to school." Elena felt the weight of the silence in the room. She wanted to be helpful. She wanted to show David that she wasn't a burden. She saw an empty pan on the counter and David's finished plate. She stood up quickly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Let me help with those," Elena said. "You don't have to do that," David said. "I want to. It's the least I can do." Elena reached for a ceramic plate, sitting near the edge of the sink. Her movements were awkward. She had never spent time in a kitchen that didn't have a staff. As she reached out, her sleeve caught on the handle of a heavy mug. The ceramic plate slipped from her fingers and hit the floor. It shattered into a dozen sharp pieces. Elena gasped. She stepped back, her face going pale. She stared at the broken shards, her chest tightening. She waited for the shouting to start. She waited for David to tell her how stupid she was, or how much that plate cost. That was how Victoria Vance handled mistakes. That was how her husband had talked to her whenever she wasn't perfect. "I'm so sorry," Elena whispered. She was trembling. "I'll pay for it. I'll buy you a whole new set. I didn't mean to." David stood up and walked toward her. Elena flinched slightly. But David didn't raise his voice. He just looked at the floor and then back at her. "It's just a plate, Elena," David said. He reached into a closet and pulled out a broom. "It's been cracked for a year anyway. Don't worry about it." Chloe ran over and took Elena's hand. "Don't be sad. Dad breaks things all the time. One time he broke the whole sink." "I did not break the whole sink," David said, though he was smiling. "Chloe, go get your backpack. We're going to be late." Elena watched them. She had never seen someone react to a mistake with a smile. It felt strange. It felt wrong, but in a way that made her heart ache. David finished sweeping up the glass and dumped it in the trash. He grabbed a set of keys and a worn work bag from the counter. "Chloe is going to be at school until 3, David said. "There is ham and cheese in the fridge for lunch. Don't answer the door for anyone. I mean anyone." "I understand," Elena said. "I'll be back by 5. If you need anything." There is a list of emergency numbers on the fridge. David walked to the front door, Chloe trailing behind him. He stopped at the threshold and looked back at Elena. She was standing in the middle of his kitchen, looking lost in his old t-shirt. She looked like a woman who had millions of dollars in her bag, but didn't know how to wash a dish. David walked out and locked the door. He headed toward his old truck, his mind racing. He thought about the way she looked at the plastic fork. He thought about the way she panicked over a broken plate. He thought about the cash in that envelope. As he pulled out of the driveway, David looked at the rearview mirror. He saw Elena standing at the window, watching them leave. She didn't look like a nanny. She didn't even look like a girl from the suburbs. She looked like someone who had spent her whole life behind a high wall. And now that the wall was gone, she was terrified of the open air. David gripped the steering wheel. He had a job to do at the Aegis warehouse, but for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about work. He was thinking about the woman in his house. He knew she was lying about who she was. What he didn't know was that the people looking for her were a lot closer than he imagined. At the end of the street, a black SUV with tinted windows sat idling, its driver watching David's truck disappear around the corner. The old truck groaned as David pulled it into the driveway. He had left the warehouse 2 hours early. The facility manager had been in a foul mood, but David didn't care. The heater in his house was clunking so loudly he could hear it from the porch, and with a pregnant woman and a child inside, he couldn't let the house get cold. He walked through the front door and found the living room empty. Chloe was at her friend's house down the street for a play date. The house was strangely quiet. He walked toward the kitchen and saw a note on the table. It was from Elena. The heater stopped blowing warm air. "I'm going to lay down for a bit." David grabbed his toolbox from under the sink. He knew the guest room was the coldest spot in the house because the floorboards sat right over the main intake pipe. If the heat was failing, that was where he needed to start. He walked to the guest room door and pushed it open slowly. The curtains were drawn, casting the room in a dim, gray light. Elena was curled up on her side on top of the covers. She was still wearing the oversized t-shirt he had given her. She looked small against the pillows, her hand resting on her stomach even in sleep. David tried to move quietly, but the floorboards creaked under his boots. She didn't stir. She looked exhausted, as if she hadn't slept for a week before arriving on his doorstep. David knelt by the side of the bed. He needed to reach the vent cover tucked against the wall. He pulled a screwdriver from his belt and leaned forward, his shoulder brushing against the edge of the mattress. As he reached under the frame to find the screw, his hand hit something hard. It wasn't a dust bunny or a lost toy. It was a small, heavy object. He pulled it out, thinking it might be a piece of the heater vent that had fallen off. In the dim light, the object caught a sliver of sun from the gap in the curtains. It was a name tag made of solid platinum. The metal felt cold and expensive in his palm. He held it closer to his eyes. In the center was a raised logo, the sharp, geometric eagle of Aegis Corp. Below the logo, the engraving was deep and perfect. Elena Vance, Chief Executive Officer. David's breath hitched. He sat back on his heels, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the woman sleeping just inches away from him, then back at the piece of metal. He worked in the Philadelphia warehouse of Aegis Corp. He spent 10 hours a day moving crates that had Aegis stamped on the side. He had seen the name Vance on digital manifests 1,000 times. Every paycheck he received, every safety manual he read, and every corporate memo posted on the break room wall came from the office of the person whose name was on this tag. This wasn't just a runaway. This was the woman who owned the company that fed his daughter. She was one of the most powerful people in the country, a billionaire whose face was never in the newspapers but whose name was everywhere in the business world. He looked around the small, cramped room. The wallpaper was peeling in the corner. The dresser was a cheap piece of furniture he'd bought at a yard sale. Elena Vance, the CEO of Aegis, was sleeping in his guest room because she had nowhere else to go. David felt a wave of confusion. Why would someone with that much power be running away with a bag full of cash? Why did she look so terrified when she broke a $20 plate? He looked at her pale face. He saw the dark circles under her eyes and the way her fingers clutched the blanket. He realized that to the people in Manhattan, she was a title and a bank account. But here, in this room, she was just a woman who was scared for her baby. He thought about Marcus Sterling and the suits who ran the company. He had seen them on the corporate news feeds. They looked like sharks. If they were the ones looking for her, he understood why she had run. David looked at the platinum tag one last time. It represented a world he would never belong to. He carefully reached out and tucked it into the side pocket of her leather bag, which was sitting on the floor by the nightstand. He did it so gently that the bag didn't even shift. He stood up and walked out of the room, leaving the heater vent unfixed for now. He went into the living room and sat on the sofa. He stared at the wall for a long time. "She's the boss," he whispered to the empty room. He thought about the $5,000. He thought about the black SUV he had seen at the end of the block. The pieces were starting to fit together, and they formed a picture that was much more dangerous than he had imagined. He took a deep breath and stood up. He decided right then that he wouldn't say a word. He wouldn't treat her any differently. If she wanted to be a stranger named Elena Smith, he would let her. "In this house, she isn't the CEO," David said firmly. "She's just Elena." He walked back to the kitchen to start dinner, trying to act like his life hadn't just changed. He was reaching for a pot when the house phone rang. It was a landline he rarely used. He picked it up. "Hello?" There was a long pause on the other end. Then, a man's voice spoke. It was cold, professional, and completely devoid of emotion. "Mr. Miller? I'm calling from the Aegis Corporate Security Office. We're doing a routine audit of employee residences in the Philadelphia area. We'd like to stop by this evening to verify some information. Will you be home at 6? David's hand tightened on the receiver. He looked at the guest room door. "I'm busy tonight." "What is this about?" "It's just a formality, David. We'll see you at 6. The line went dead. David looked at the clock. It was 5:15 p.m. He had 45 minutes before the sharks arrived at his door. David hung up the landline and stared at the receiver for a long minute. His heart was still racing from the call. He had 45 minutes until Aegis security arrived, and he needed to act normal. He couldn't let Elena know he was panicked. When he heard the guest room door creak open, he quickly wiped his palms on his jeans and forced a smile. "Did you sleep okay?" David asked. "The heater stopped making that clicking sound, so I finally drifted off," Elena said. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "Is something wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just some work stuff on my mind," David said quickly. "The sun is finally out. I was thinking about doing some work on the flower beds before the next frost. You want to come outside?" "Chloe is already out there." Elena hesitated. She hadn't been outside since she arrived, fearing someone might recognize her, but the small house felt cramped, and the idea of fresh air was tempting. "Okay, I'll come out." The yard was small and fenced in. Chloe was already kneeling in the dirt with a plastic shovel, digging a hole for no particular reason. David handed Elena a small garden trowel and a pair of old work gloves. "The soil is a bit hard," David said, kneeling next to a patch of wilted lilies. "You have to turn it over to let the roots breathe. Like this." Elena put on the gloves and knelt down. It was awkward with her stomach, but she managed to find a comfortable position. She pushed the metal tool into the earth. She had never touched dirt in her life. Back in her old world, the grounds were maintained by a crew of 12 men who moved like ghosts in the early morning. She had never known the name of a single plant in her own garden. "It's messy," Elena said, looking at the dark mud clinging to her gloves. "It's supposed to be," David said. "It's good for you. My wife used to say that you can't grow anything beautiful without getting your hands dirty first." "She liked gardening?" Elena asked. "She loved it. She planted these lilies the year Chloe was born. Since she passed away 5 years ago, I've tried to keep them going. I'm not as good at it as she was, but I try. Chloe is the one who keeps me honest. She's my motivation for everything. If I didn't have her, I'm not sure I'd bother with much of anything." Elena stopped digging. She looked at David, who was carefully pulling a weed from the base of a plant. He spoke with a sincerity she didn't know existed. In her world, people spoke in bullet points and calculated risks. "I lost my husband last year," Elena said softly. "In an accident." "I'm sorry," David said. "Don't be." It wasn't a marriage like yours. It was an arrangement. Our fathers wanted to merge their empires, and we were the bridge. There was no love, David. There were no shared hobbies or quiet mornings in the yard. We lived in a house with 20 rooms, and most days, we didn't even see each other. Even when he was alive, I was alone. David looked at her. He saw the way her shoulders slumped. He realized that the money she had didn't buy her a single moment of the peace he felt every day with Chloe. To him, she was no longer a mysterious tenant or a powerful executive. She was a woman who had spent her life in a cage, and she was finally trying to breathe. "Well," David said, "you're not alone here." Elena felt a lump in her throat. For the first time, she felt like someone was actually seeing her, not her bank account or her last name. She went back to digging, the physical work grounding her. Chloe suddenly dropped her shovel and ran over, throwing her arms around Elena's middle. The little girl pressed her ear against Elena's stomach. "The baby kicked me!" Chloe shouted. "Dad, the baby kicked me! It felt like a little thump!" Elena let out a laugh. It was a bright, radiant sound that echoed through the quiet yard. She looked down at Chloe and then up at David. Her face lit up with a genuine joy that hadn't been there before. David watched her. He had seen her cold and scared, but this was different. She looked beautiful. He wanted this moment to last forever, but then he heard the sound of a heavy engine. A black SUV with tinted windows turned the corner and began to crawl slowly down the street. It didn't look like a local car. It moved like a predator looking for a scent. David's stomach dropped. He stood up, shielding Elena and Chloe with his body. "Inside. Both of you. Now," David said. His voice was a low growl that Elena had never heard before. He didn't wait for her to ask questions. He grabbed Chloe by the arm and ushered them through the back door, his eyes never leaving the black SUV that was idling at the end of the street. Elena stumbled over the threshold, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked back at David as he slammed the door and locked it. "David, what's going on? Who is in that car?" "I don't know," David said, his breathing heavy. "But they aren't here to say hello. Go to your room. Keep the lights off. Stay away from the windows. I mean it, Elena." He watched through the small kitchen curtain as the SUV sat there for another minute before slowly pulling away. David didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dark living room with a heavy wrench in his hand, watching the street until the sun came up on Monday morning. He knew the peace was over. Monday morning at the Aegis warehouse was usually loud with the sound of forklifts and shouting men. But today, the atmosphere was frozen. 5 security guards in black uniforms stood by the main entrance. In the center of the loading dock stood Marcus Sterling. He looked like a sharp blade in his dark Italian suit, his eyes scanning the warehouse floor with pure contempt. "Listen up, Greg," the warehouse manager yelled. "The vice president is here for a mandatory inspection. Nobody leaves their station. Nobody talks unless they are talked to." Marcus held up a grainy sketch of a woman. It was Elena, though the artist hadn't quite captured the softness in her eyes. Marcus walked over to Greg's small glass office. "I want the personnel files for everyone who was on the night shift last Tuesday," Marcus said. David stood at his station, his hands trembling slightly as he pretended to check the inventory on his clipboard. He watched through the glass as Marcus flipped through the folders. Marcus stopped on one. He pulled a sheet of paper out and stared at it. "David Miller," Marcus said loudly, his voice echoing in the quiet warehouse. Greg looked at the paper. "Dave? He's one of my best guys. He's been here 10 years. He was absent on Wednesday morning," Marcus said. "The morning after our CEO went missing, and my investigators traced a signal from a burner phone to a tower 3 blocks from his house. Get him in here, now." Greg walked out of the office and signaled to David. The other workers stepped back, their eyes wide with fear. Nobody wanted to be the center of Marcus Sterling's attention. David wiped his greasy hands on a rag and walked toward the office. He kept his face calm, but his mind was racing. He thought about the platinum name tag in Elena's bag. He thought about Chloe's drawing on the fridge. David stepped into the office. The air smelled like expensive cologne and fear. Marcus didn't look up at first. He just tapped his manicured finger on David's file. You like your job, David? Marcus asked. I have a daughter to feed. So, yes. Then why were you absent last Wednesday? Greg says you called in sick, but you didn't go to a doctor. You went to a bus station. My men found a witness who saw a man with your description picking up a woman in a storm. David didn't blink. I don't know what you're talking about. I had a fever. I stayed home. Marcus stood up and walked around the desk. He was shorter than David, but the power he held made him seem like a giant. He leaned in close, his eyes dark and hateful. You're a liar, Miller. You're a low-level worker who thinks he can play a hero. You have a clean record, but that can change in a second. I can make sure you never work in this state again. I can make sure your daughter ends up in the system because you can't provide for her. Is that what you want? I'm just a warehouse worker, Mr. Sterling. I don't know anything about your business. Marcus, Nesh Mep, Mot Nukuri, Kong Ko Chut Ap now. Han Tien Ligun David. Amadaisu de Dor. Really? Because I've been doing some digging into your finances, David. You're drowning in debt, and yet you suddenly paid off 3 months of back rent last Friday. In cash. Marcus sat on the edge of the desk, looking at David like a predator watching a trapped animal. So, tell me, David, Marcus said. I heard you just got a new tenant in that spare room of yours. Is she comfortable? David kept his hands at his sides. He could feel the sweat cooling on his neck. Marcus was leaning against the desk, waiting for a slip-up. My cousin is staying with me. She's going through a rough patch with her husband. It's a family matter. A cousin. That's funny. I've looked at your emergency contact list, Miller. You don't have any cousins in the tri-state area. You have an aunt in Ohio and a brother in the army. So, who is the lady? I don't have to explain my house guests to you. Marcus stood up slowly. He picked up David's ceramic coffee mug from the desk. It was an old mug with a faded World's Best Dad logo on it. He looked at the dark liquid inside and then looked at David's work boots. You think you're being a hero, don't you? You think you're protecting something important. Marcus tilted the mug. The hot coffee poured out in a steady stream, splashing over David's boots and onto the floor. David didn't move. He felt the heat soak through the leather of his shoes. Marcus let the mug go. It hit the concrete floor and shattered into a dozen sharp pieces. Clean that up. David looked down at the mess. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a movement near the heavy plastic curtains of the loading dock. A woman was standing there. It was Elena. She was holding his heavy winter jacket. She must have seen the snow forecast and walked all the way to the warehouse to bring it to him. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with horror as she watched Marcus. Elena took a step forward. She looked like she was about to scream or run toward them. David's heart stopped. If she walked into the light, Marcus would have her. The life David was trying to build for Chloe. The safety of the woman in his house, it would all be gone in a second. David dropped to his knees. He didn't look at Marcus. He focused on the broken ceramic shards. He began picking them up with his bare hands. One of the pieces was sharp and sliced into his thumb, but he didn't flinch. He just kept gathering the glass. That's better, Marcus said. Know your place, Miller. You're a low-level worker. You're nothing. Marcus raised his foot and stepped down hard on David's hand. He ground his expensive leather sole into David's knuckles, forcing the broken ceramic pieces deeper into David's skin. You're just a loyal, cheap dog. That's all you'll ever be. Remember that before you try to lie to me again. David gritted his teeth. The pain was sharp, but he kept his head down. He watched Elena from the shadows. She was trembling violently. Tears were streaming down her face, but she had stayed in the dark. She had pulled out her phone and was holding it steady, recording everything. She saw the way Marcus's boot pressed into David's hand. She saw the blood dripping onto the concrete. I'll give you 24 hours, Marcus said. If that woman isn't gone, or if I find out you're lying, you're finished, and I'll make sure the state takes your kid. I have friends in high places, David. Don't forget that. Marcus turned and walked away, his security team following behind him like a pack of wolves. David stayed on his knees until he heard the sound of their car doors slamming shut. Elena didn't wait. She turned and ran. She moved as fast as she could with her heavy stomach, disappearing behind the stacks of crates. David stood up slowly. His hand was throbbing, and blood was smeared across his palm. He took a rag from his pocket and wrapped it tightly around his knuckles. He walked to the edge of the loading dock and looked out at the street. He saw Elena. She was running toward the bus stop at the end of the block. She looked small and terrified in the gray light of the afternoon. She climbed onto the bus just as the doors were closing. David watched the bus pull away. He looked down at his blood-stained rag and then at the empty spot where Marcus's car had been. He felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He turned back to the warehouse, but he stopped when he saw Greg standing in the shadows of the office. Greg was holding a manila envelope, and his face was white. "David," Greg whispered, "you need to see this. Marcus dropped it when he was yelling at you." David took the envelope. He opened it and pulled out a stack of surveillance photos. His blood turned to ice. They weren't just photos of Elena. They were photos of Chloe walking to school that morning, with a red cross drawn over her face. David stood in the driveway for a long time, clutching the manila envelope. The image of the red cross over Chloe's face burned in his mind. He tucked the envelope deep under the driver's seat of his truck. He couldn't bring it inside. He took several deep breaths, wiped the dried blood from his knuckles with a dirty rag, and walked into the house. The kitchen was quiet. Chloe was in her room, humming a song while she finished her homework. Elena was sitting at the table. She had a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth ready. She looked at his hand the moment he stepped into the light. "You're late," Elena said. "Things got busy at the warehouse," David replied. He tried to hide his hand behind his back, but the blood-soaked rag was too obvious. "Sit down, David, please." David sat in the creaky wooden chair. Elena moved toward him. She didn't ask for permission. She gently took his wrist and began to unwrap the dirty rag. When she saw the deep cuts from the ceramic shards and the purple bruising from Marcus's boot, her fingers trembled. She dipped the cloth into the warm water and began to wash the wounds. "It looks painful," Elena said. "It's just a scratch. I was moving some heavy crates and lost my grip. I'm getting clumsy in my old age." Elena stopped cleaning for a second. She looked him in the eye. She knew he was lying. She had been there. She had seen him on his knees. She had heard the insults Marcus hurled at him. She looked down at his hand again, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Did you see anyone unusual at the warehouse today?" David hesitated. He thought about the photos of Chloe. If he told Elena the truth, she would run again to protect them. If he lied, he could keep her close for a little longer. No, just the usual managers. A lot of shouting about inventory, but nothing out of the ordinary. "Why do you ask?" "I heard some sirens earlier. I thought maybe something happened. Everything is fine." "Elena, it's just a normal Monday." Elena finished bandaging his hand with clean gauze. She stood up and went to the stove, pouring a cup of chamomile tea. She set it in front of him. It was a simple gesture, but it felt heavy. For the first time since she arrived, she wasn't the one being taken care of. "Drink this," she said. "It helps with the stress." David took a sip. The warmth spread through his chest. He looked at her and saw the way she was looking at him. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a deep, quiet respect. Elena leaned forward and rested her head on David's shoulder. She felt the rough fabric of his work shirt against her cheek. For the first time in her life, Elena didn't feel like a CEO. She didn't feel like an heir or a business asset. She felt safe. She knew that David was lying to protect her peace, and she was lying to protect his pride. It was a silent agreement between them. "I'm glad you're home," Elena said. "I'm not going anywhere," David replied. An hour later, David went to bed. He was exhausted, the weight of Marcus's threats pressing down on him. Elena waited until the house was completely silent. She made sure Chloe was asleep and then went back to the kitchen. She pulled her laptop from her bag. She sat at the table where David had just been sitting. She opened a secure, encrypted messaging app. She typed in a code that only 2 people in the world knew. A few seconds later, a window popped up. "Arthur is online. I need you," Elena typed. "I've been waiting for your signal." The reply came instantly. "Where are you?" "I'm safe for now." "But Marcus Sterling visited the Philadelphia warehouse today. He is threatening the people I'm staying with. He is threatening a child." "Arthur, what do you want to do?" Elena looked at the video file on her desktop. It was the recording of Marcus stepping on David's hand. She looked at the folders she had copied from the Manhattan office, containing years of Marcus's illegal offshore accounts. "I want to end this," Elena typed. "I'm sending you the footage and the bank records. I want Marcus and Victoria Vance removed from the board. I want them to lose everything. Can you do it without exposing my location? It will be difficult, but I can leak it through an anonymous whistleblower portal. The FBI will be at their door by morning. Do it. Don't wait." Elena closed the laptop. She felt a cold chill run down her spine. She had fired the first shot in a war that would change her life forever. She looked toward David's room, hoping she had done enough to keep them safe. Time passed quickly. Early the next morning, David knelt on the linoleum floor, pulling the laces tight on Chloe's sneakers. He was moving slowly, his mind heavy with the threats Marcus had made. "Dad, you're doing it too tight," Chloe said. "Sorry, honey. Just wanted to make sure they don't come undone at recess." "Are you going to work today?" "I'm not sure yet. I might stay home and finish that project in the yard." In the background, the old television on the counter was tuned to the local morning news. It was mostly weather and traffic until a bright red breaking news graphic flashed across the screen. The anchor's voice became serious, her volume cutting through the quiet hum of the kitchen. "We are receiving reports of a massive federal raid at the Manhattan headquarters of Aegis Corporation," the anchor said. David stopped moving. He stayed on one knee, his eyes locked on the screen. Elena was standing at the stove, calmly scooping oatmeal into a bowl for Chloe. She didn't turn around, but her shoulders went still. "Federal agents have taken several top executives into custody this morning," the news report continued. "Among those arrested are Vice President Marcus Sterling and Victoria Vance, the matriarch of the Vance shipping empire. They are being charged with multi-million-dollar financial fraud and, in a shocking twist, severe labor law violations." A grainy video began to play on the screen. It was the footage Elena had recorded at the warehouse. It showed Marcus Sterling's expensive boots grinding into David's hand. It showed the pure arrogance on Marcus's face as he insulted the workers. An anonymous whistleblower leaked this footage along with thousands of pages of encrypted bank records late last night, the anchor explained. "The evidence suggests a massive cover-up of offshore accounts and a pattern of physical and verbal abuse toward employees." Marcus Sterling was seen being led out of his home in handcuffs just moments ago. The screen showed Marcus. He was no longer the powerful man in the Italian suit. He looked small, his hair messy, his face pale as he was pushed into the back of a police car. Victoria Vance followed him, her face hidden behind a fur coat as she tried to dodge the cameras. David stood up slowly. He felt a weight lift off his chest that he hadn't realized he was carrying. He looked at the bandage on his hand, then at the TV, and finally at Elena. Elena set the bowl of oatmeal down in front of Chloe. She looked completely at peace. Her face was calm, and there was no trace of the terrified woman who had arrived in the rain. She caught David's gaze and gave him a tiny, knowing nod. "Chloe, eat your breakfast," Elena said. "It's getting cold." "Is that the man from the warehouse, Dad?" Chloe asked, pointing at the screen. "The mean one?" "Yes, Chloe," David said. He felt a lump in his throat. "That's him. But he won't be coming back. Not today. Not ever." "Good," Chloe said, taking a big bite of her oatmeal. "He was a bully." David walked over to Elena. He stood next to her at the counter, watching the news report go into more detail about the fraud charges. He knew this was her doing. She had used her power to protect his family. "You did it," David whispered. "I don't know what you're talking about," Elena replied. "I was just making breakfast." "Elena, thank you. You don't know what this means." "I think I do," she said. She reached out and briefly touched his bandaged hand. "No one gets to hurt the people who took me in, not on my watch." A sense of relief flooded the house. For the first time in days, the air felt light. David smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. He felt safe in his own home again. He was about to turn off the TV and get Chloe her backpack when he saw something through the window. A sleek, black Cadillac pulled into the driveway. It wasn't a police car, and it wasn't the SUV from last night. It was a car that screamed money and authority. A man in a sharp gray suit stepped out of the driver's side. He didn't look like a thug. He looked like a lawyer. He adjusted his glasses, checked the house number, and began walking toward the front door with a heavy leather briefcase. David's smile faded. He looked at Elena, whose expression had suddenly turned guarded. The man reached the porch and knocked. It wasn't a frantic thud like Elena's first night, or a threat like Marcus's. It was the steady, rhythmic knock of a man who was here to collect something. David walked to the door and opened it. "Can I help you?" David asked. "I'm looking for Eleanor Vance," the man said. He looked past David and saw Elena standing in the kitchen. He bowed his head slightly. "Theobald, it is time. The board of directors is waiting." Arthur followed David into the kitchen. He was a man who had spent 40 years serving the Vance family, and he looked completely out of place in the small house. He set his leather briefcase on the table, right next to a pile of Chloe's coloring books. David didn't sit down. He stood by the sink with his arms crossed, watching the man in the expensive suit. "I've spent the last 6 hours at the federal building," Arthur said. "Marcus and Victoria are being processed. The evidence you provided was undeniable. The board held an emergency session an hour ago. They want you back, Elena. They need you to stabilize the company and lead them through the restructuring." He opened the briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. The Aegis Corp logo was embossed at the top in gold. "Everything is ready," Arthur continued. "There is a private jet waiting at the airport. You can be back in Manhattan by tonight. We've already contacted the best maternity specialists in the city. You'll have the highest level of care for the rest of your pregnancy." Elena didn't look at the papers. She didn't even look at the briefcase. She walked over to the kitchen window and pushed the small curtain aside. In the backyard, the afternoon sun was warm and golden. David was kneeling in the grass, his forehead covered in sweat. He was holding a piece of sanded wood while Chloe helped him steady a hammer. They were building a crib. David had spent his extra savings on the wood, and he was putting it together by hand. He wasn't doing it because it was his job. He was doing it because he wanted the baby to have something safe and sturdy. Elena watched David laugh at something Chloe said. He wiped the dirt off the little girl's cheek with his thumb. It was a scene so simple and so full of genuine love that it made the gold-embossed papers on the table look like nothing more than waste paper. "The company is in good hands with the interim board," Elena said. She didn't turn away from the window. "They don't need me as much as they think they do." "Eleanor, you are the majority shareholder," Arthur said. "You are the CEO. You can't just walk away from an empire." Elena finally turned around. She looked at the kitchen. It was small. The heater was still making a low humming sound. The plates in the cupboard were mismatched, but it was the first place in her entire life where she didn't feel like she was being used. "Arthur, my whole life I've been what everyone else wanted me to be," Elena said. "I was a daughter to be traded, a wife for a merger, and a name on a corporate chart. I was a business asset. I wasn't a person. The world expects you to lead, Theobald." "Then the world will be disappointed," Elena said. She walked to the table and pushed the documents back toward Arthur. "I'm not going back to Manhattan. I'm not going back to being a Vance." Arthur looked at her, his expression full of confusion. "If you stay here, who will you be?" Elena looked out the window one more time. She saw David look toward the house and wave at her. She felt a warmth in her chest that she had never felt in a boardroom. "Thank you for everything, Arthur. You've been a good friend to me." But CEO Elena Vance disappeared in that storm a few weeks ago. "She isn't coming back." Arthur stared at her for a long time. He saw the peace on her face. He realized that she finally looked like she could breathe. "And the woman standing here?" Arthur asked. "Who is she?" Elena smiled. "Her name is Elena Miller." Arthur didn't argue. He had been a lawyer long enough to know when a decision was final. He closed his briefcase and stood up. He walked to the front door and paused for a second to look back at her. "I'll make sure your trust funds are managed according to your new instructions. Good luck, Elena." He walked out and got into his car. David waited until the Cadillac had pulled away before he walked back into the house. He was wiping sawdust off his hands with an old rag. He walked into the kitchen and saw the empty table. He looked at Elena, his eyes searching hers with a deep, quiet understanding. "Hodiroya?" David asked. "Vung," Elena replied. "They're gone." David looked at the spot where the Aegis Corp folders had been. He didn't ask her about the billions of dollars she was leaving behind. He didn't ask her why she had used his last name. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what she had chosen. "Moi chuyen kethukroi," Elena said. David nodded. He walked over and took her hand. His palm was rough from work, but his grip was steady and gentle. He led her toward the dining table, where Chloe was already sitting. "An toi thoi," David said. "Chloe is waiting for you." Elena sat down. The kitchen was filled with the smell of a simple dinner and the warm glow of the light overhead. Outside, the world was still loud and full of people fighting for power, but inside the small house, it was quiet. They sat together, a family built on a choice made in the middle of a storm. Elena looked at David and Chloe, and for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged. And that is today's bedtime story. We would love to hear your thoughts on Elena's journey. Do you think she made the right choice by walking away from her empire to stay with David and Chloe? Please share how this story made you feel in the comments below. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end. We truly appreciate your time and your support. This story reminds us all that true wealth is never found in a bank account or a powerful title. Instead, it is found in the simple moments of kindness and the people who make us feel safe and loved for who we truly are. Sometimes, the family we choose is the greatest treasure of all. Good night, and we will see you in the next story.